Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Hector Rodriguez. I am a principal industry specialist and security leader at AWS. The industry I focus on and have focused on for over 30 years is health and life sciences. I actually grew up in New Jersey, got my undergraduate degree in computer science and math from Rutgers, got my MBA there also years later after spending a little bit of time on Wall Street. But started my career at Bell Research Labs, where I was a software engineer. And I just realized when I was thinking about that, I really miss having my phone on the wall. Who remembers Ma Bell? I went through that breakup. It's why I came to work on Wall Street during that time period, because I did not want to end up somewhere that Bell didn't know where I was going to go. I think they originally threatened to send me to Dallas. And I was like, I'm a New Jersey boy. Dallas in 1983 just didn't sound right. But it's been great. It's been a great time that I've spent working in health and life sciences. I remember developing some clinical trials reporting systems for organizations like Merck, Sandoz Pharmaceuticals when they were still around. I don't know who they're with now, and a number of others. But the other thing, as a developer, I realized early on when HIPAA was written in '96 and we started to implement it is no one was paying attention to security, privacy, and compliance. And technologists, that's just the way we work. We get a spec put in front of us and we focus on just getting that to work. And security was always an afterthought. And that is actually the worst thing you can do as a development organization, is add on security afterwards. You miss a lot of the vulnerabilities, you introduce vulnerabilities. And that's why it is great today where we see newer integrated development environments like Amazon Q Developer that's doing some of those security checks for you, that are checking if you're using open source, if that open source has vulnerabilities that are on the common vulnerabilities or the National Vulnerability Database, and so on. So just using those tools. But one of the things that I do want to mention that was said earlier is let your cloud providers do that heavy lifting for you. I won't talk a lot about that in my slides because we want to dig into scalable data security, but organizations like AWS, I've been here about 5 years. Before that, I did work at Microsoft for 15 years. I've worked for small and large technology companies. But when your cloud provider does that heavy lifting for you, it enables you to focus on what problem you're really trying to solve. Just like what we saw with Click Therapeutics. They inherited the control framework for HIPAA, for HITRUST, for GXP, if they work with FedRAMP and ISO. We do that for over 140 different privacy, security frameworks and regulations around the world. And you inherit that. That work is being done for you by hundreds of people that in reality you shouldn't hire. And in many cases, you can't afford to hire. And you probably don't want to hire them anyway. Security people are expensive. So I always start with taking a look at what problem are we trying to solve? What are scalable data security services? Well, it starts with the fact that being scalable means you have to grow very quickly. And you can scale both up and down, by the way. And that's one of the great things about serverless computing that was mentioned earlier. The serverless computing model was introduced by AWS, and it's based on a model that scales with what you need, both up, and then it scales down if you don't need it. And that's always been one of the great things about cloud computing. But it is about making sure you scale without degrading not just your performance, but your security. When you degrade your security, you compromise everything else you've done. Also, when you don't start with security, you are compromised just out of the gates. And a lot of people don't know it. But that's probably the worst thing you could do, is not start with security. And I have this conversation with customers every day because everybody's still doing it. It's just bad behavior. Now, the other thing by adding security is it was mentioned earlier, you're trying to protect unauthorized access, but the other thing is you're trying to ensure data integrity. And that data integrity needs to be ensured across what I call your whole security chain of custody. So again, it's not just the data that's right in front of you or what your organization is doing, is do you know how your third parties, your supply chain partners, the other organizations you work with, how are they securing their data? So you have to look at that whole ecosystem, and that's a huge challenge in healthcare. If you look at some of the recent situations that we've had, some of the incidents that we had at Change Health or others, those were supply chain attacks that occurred in an organization that some people didn't even know they were using. They didn't even know they had this third-party software installed, but suddenly it brought their whole business to a halt. So you want to make sure that you are focused on integrity and that everyone you're working with is complying with standards. When you do those things, and you add them up together, what you get, and in today's world, you're really looking for cloud services that will automatically do this for you, that they will consistently apply those protections, they will scale your performance, and they won't deviate. Someone earlier mentioned config. Config is a service or a set of configuration rules in AWS that are in place to do exactly that, to make sure you're not drifting from what your intended configurations were meant to be. So one of the things that when we look at this at AWS, and this was mentioned earlier, and I can't believe they didn't have data at rest and data in transit encryption. That's almost a given, but we still find that a lot. But what organizations really need, first of all, they need to make sure they're encrypting data at rest. That is one of the big changes, and we'll have this conversation with the regulations changing today, not just here in the US with the new I'll say proposed HIPAA rule. We'll see where that goes. But one of the things that they're saying is these controls are now required. They're not addressable. They're not optional. And encryption at rest is finally in there. At AWS, we've always required data at rest to be encrypted under our regulatory agreements for protected health information and other sensitive information. Data in transit always needs to be encrypted, but application credentials, the use of secrets, and a lot of times organizations will hard code some of this into their code or into their development because why do they do it? Because it's fast and it's easy. And again, people don't think about how they are compromising that ecosystem of applications or services. And in reality, someone did it, probably a developer did it just out of being lazy. But being able to manage your secrets at scale is another way to protect your applications. And then the big one is lifecycle management. And Hans spoke about some of these things, but being able to automate as much as that is possible in your software development lifecycle, so in your CD pipelines and so on. And one of the other keys about this, about automation, one of the things that we do at AWS, it's absolutely fascinating, and the other cloud providers tend to do this also, is we're always looking at how we can take people out of the equation. And this doesn't mean taking over people's job. There's always going to be that human in the middle requirement. And I know we get into a lot of conversations around the role of AI, but really good automation does have people who are involved in making sure the systems are working. But what you're automating are those repetitive menial tasks, and you're trying to minimize human error and get it as close to zero as possible. Now, one of the other things that was mentioned earlier, and we saw in Hans' architecture diagram, a lot of the AWS services that they use, one of the reasons that they're able to scale so quickly and automate so much and not have as many people resources in place, is they are using serverless. So if you've never looked at the serverless architecture or capabilities in cloud computing in AWS, it's one of my favorite things that AWS does differently, is the ability to support serverless. But also, when we look at security services, we have over 300 different services or features in our security services that are designed to protect data, to protect identity, to protect the network, and so on. there is a whole category of services around data protection. And we'll take a little bit closer look at those. And again, what I like about these services is they're all scalable by design. So remember I said earlier, let your cloud provider, let AWS do that heavy lifting for you. This is a really good example of where we do that. And I'm really glad that actually Click Therapeutics went first, because that case study is real testament to exactly what we're talking about here. They started by going through some architectural designs and reviews, and AWS will do this for you. I don't know if anyone here is developing an AWS, have an app. There's a program that we call Well-Architected Framework. I think PTP will do it with you also. We will go through your design, through your application, through your workloads, and make sure that they are secure. We'll apply a security lens to that well-architected framework. We'll also apply a resilience. So are they secure? But more importantly, if something happens, how quickly will that service recover? And that's the definition of resilience, because in today's world, in health and life sciences, the worst problem that we have isn't ransomware, it's actually a lack of resilience. And that lack of resilience is causing downtime. When we have downtime in healthcare, it causes patient outcomes and even research, clinical trials to become more compromised. In the National Health System in the UK did a study after the WannaCry virus and found that their in-hospital mortality rates increased during that attack. A recent release by Ponemon Institute shows that when that happens in most hospitals or healthcare settings, the mortality rates are now increasing by about, depending on what report you read, anywhere from 25 to 35%. That number is really high. It used to be less than 10%. So it's getting worse before it gets better. But if you look at some of these services, the key management service, again, in AWS under key management service, you have choices on how you're going to use encryption keys. And if you're going to use a cloud hardware security manager and so on. So it's one of the other things that AWS is designed to do. It's designed to be secure and resilient by design. That's how our infrastructure is built. That's how all of our services are built. We also have a assurance and auditing team, a third party that works on all of this. So we go through a HIPAA audit, we go through a FedRAMP audit, through ISO audits, through HITRUST. We have both internal and external teams doing that work for us. And all of those reports, those SOC reports, all of that's available to you also as an organization to show your auditors. It's one of the things that I like about it, because I get asked for the SOC report all the time. You can just go up and get it. And when an auditor comes to you and says, we need that SOC report, you have it right there. It's one of the fastest things you can do. It saves you a lot of time and hunting. Years ago, it took forever to get a SOC report from a vendor. So just easy things like that also scale very quickly. But the certificate manager and the certificate authority that was mentioned earlier, these are the ability to automate your capability to get your certificates when you need them, and then use private certificates for service-to-service authorization. We've recently launched some new services called verified access, verified permissions. There's a number of new services that come out with AWS, particularly in security, but they're extremely innovative services. They're using AI and data, machine learning to reason over your security data, but to make sure that your security posture is not being compromised. So we work on something called continuous security posture improvement, continuous resilience monitoring, and that's what these services come together to do. Earlier, I mentioned Secrets Manager. That's just really managing the life cycle of your secrets, your internal secrets that you want to share between services, but you don't want to hard code and so on. And then the last one I'll mention here is the AWS auto scaling, which isn't really a data protection capability, but with auto scaling, what you're doing is you're configuring your architecture to say, this is when you just spin up new servers and services. And this is when you bring them back down. So again, you're reducing that menial task of having to introduce a system administrator or an architect to come in and rework your architecture. You're allowing the cloud services to do that work for you. And there's a lot that you can do. So at AWS, we do publish a security reference architecture. We publish what are called landing zones. There are a number of GitHub libraries. There are a number of exercises that we'll run with you to make sure that your applications are secure and resilient. I mentioned a well-architected framework. Again, a partner like PTP can deliver those and do that work with you. We've a couple of years ago, we launched a service that I thought was really interesting called Resilience Hub. Resilience Hub is designed to help you measure your response time objective, your response point objective, and other metrics around your security requirements. I do a lot of tabletop exercises with customers, and one of the things I find is customers don't design metrics into how they expect their security systems to perform. So you have to start looking at your mean time to response, your mean time between incidents, your cost per incident, the resources that were engaged. So when you're using a data-driven approach to measuring your security outcomes and your security benefits, it helps you, again, improve your overall security posture. And more importantly, it helps you as an organization become more resilient. And I go back to that definition of resilience. And I love the work that is done by the International Red Cross Federation. They have a whole resilience framework, but they focus on something called community resilience. And I always say, let's apply that same approach to security. So we're not just looking at that application that's right in front of us, we're looking at the ecosystem. And today, with the introduction of medical devices into life sciences for solutions such as remote clinical trials, we're seeing software as a medical device more and more. We've got new standards coming out for the software bill of materials for these software as a medical device and devices. What we're seeing is this explosion of an ecosystem where I call it the rise of machines, but it's the rise of medical devices are going to be everywhere. And that's a new ecosystem that has to be secured at all points of contact. Again, not just based on what's right in front of you. So, we've got a couple of QR codes here we can follow up, but take a look at what your cloud provider can do for you, leverage that work, and then, like Click Therapeutics, you get to focus on the problem that you're trying to solve.